Hello everybody, and welcome back to the channel, as always. I hope you're having a wonderful Friday. I sure am. But today we are going to pick up from where we left off, which was chapter 8. And we're going to read chapter 9 today, which is the second to last one. There's 10 chapters and this is chapter 9. And if you remember, again, they were, fooling around with Smidge last time and Miss Crawley with Karlson dressing up as a ghost, and then they ended up actually having dinner together, and Miss Crawley and Karlson ended up becoming friends. At least that's what it seems like so far. So, chapter 9 is called Noble Maiden Takes to the Air. The next day, Smidge slept in. He was woken by the ringing of the telephone and rushed into the hall to answer. It was Mum. "My darling Smidge, how dreadful." "What is?" asked Smidge sleepily. "All those things you wrote in your letter. I've been so worried." "Why?" asked Smidge. "Oh, you know very well," said Mum. "Poor little chap, but I'm coming home tomorrow." Smidge felt happy and wide awake all at once. But he didn't understand why Mum was calling him poor little chap. Smidge had no sooner hung up than the phone rang again. It was his father, ringing all the way from London. "How are you?" asked Dad. "Are Seb and Sally being nice?" "I shouldn't think so," replied Smidge, "but I can't say for sure because they're in the hospital." He could hear how worried this news made his father. "In the hospital? Whatever do you mean?" And once Smidge had explained, Dad said exactly the same as Mum. "Poor little chap. I'm coming home tomorrow." That was the end of the call. But straight away, the phone rang again. This time it was Seb. "You can tell Creepy Crawley and her old doctor that whatever they're experts in, it isn't scarlet fever. Sally and I are coming home tomorrow." "Haven't you got scarlet fever, then?" asked Smidge. "No, we jolly well haven't. We've had too much hot chocolate and buns, the doctor here says. That can give you a rash, if you're especially sensitive." "A clear case of bun fever, then," said Smidge, but Seb had already rung off. As soon as Smidge was dressed, he went out to the kitchen to tell Miss Crawley his quarantine was over. She had already started preparing lunch. The whole kitchen smelt of spices. "Fine by me," said Miss Crawley, once Smidge had explained that the whole family would be coming home. "It'll be just as well for me to leave this job before my nerves are totally frayed." She was violently stirring the contents of a saucepan on the stove. She had some kind of thick stew in it, and was seasoning it generously with salt, pepper, and curry powder. "There," she said. "You have to put plenty of salt and pepper and curry in this to make it taste really good." Then she glanced uneasily at Smidge. "You don't think that dreadful Karlson will be coming home again today, do you?" "It would be nice if my last hours here could be a bit more peaceful." Before Smidge had time to answer, a cheery voice outside the window sang at top volume. "The sun has got his hat on! Hip hip hooray! The sun has got his hat on, and he's coming out today." It was Karlson, perched on the window ledge. "Hasten Hobson, here comes your little sunbeam. Now we can have some fun." But Miss Crawley held her hands up imploringly. "Oh, no, anything but more of your fun." "Well, we'll be eating first, of course," said Karlson, and skipped over to the kitchen table. Miss Crawley had laid places for herself and Smidge. Karlson sat down at one of them and seized the knife and fork. "Look sharp! Bring on the food!" He gave Miss Crawley a friendly nod. "It's all right for you to sit at the table, too. Bring yourself a plate." Then he sniffed the air. "What are we having?" "A slice of humble pie and a good hiding," said Miss Crawley, stirring her stew even more frantically. "That's what you could do with anyway. But I'm so stiff all over that I'm afraid I won't be doing any running today." She put the stew into a serving dish and brought it out to the table. "You two get on with yours," she said, "but I shall have mine afterwards. The doctors told me I need peace and quiet when I'm eating." Karlson nodded. "Well, I expect there are a few dry biscuits in a tin somewhere that you can nibble once we've polished off this lot. You have your little crusts in peace and quiet, that's fine by us." And he ladled a huge helping onto his plate. But Smidge only took a little. He was always wary of food he didn't recognize, and he had never seen a stew like this one before. Karlson started by piling all his stew into a tall mound with a moat around it. He was busy doing that. Smidge took his first cautious bite. Oh, he gasped, and tears came into his eyes. His whole mouth was on fire. But Miss Crawley was standing there, looking at him expectantly, so he swallowed and said nothing. Then Karlson looked up from his mound making. "What's up with you? Why are you crying?" I just happened to think of something tragic," stammered Smidge. "Ah, I see," said Karlson, and attacked the mound with a healthy appetite. But as soon as he had swallowed the first mouthful, he gave a yelp, and his eyes filled with tears. "What is it?" asked Miss Crawley. "Rat poison, I think. But you should know it's your concoction," said Karlson. "Quick, bring the fire extinguisher. My throat's burning up." He wiped the tears from his eyes. "What are you crying for?" asked Smidge. "I happened to think of something tragic, too," said Karlson. "What was it?" asked Smidge. "This stew," said Karlson. But that didn't please Miss Crawley at all. She said, "You kids should be ashamed of yourselves. There are thousands and thousands of children in this world who'd give anything for a stew like this." Karlson stuck his hand in his pocket and produced a notebook and a pencil. "Give me the names and addresses of 2 of them," he demanded. But Miss Crawley just muttered and refused to say. They must be fire eaters as children, the lot of them," said Karlson, "brought up on a diet of fire and brimstone." Just then there was a ring at the front door, and Miss Crawley went to answer. "Let's go with her and see who it is," said Karlson. It might be one of the 1,000 fire eaters' children coming and wanting to give anything for her fire porridge. And if it is, we need to make sure she doesn't sell it too cheap. When you think of all the expensive rat poison she must have chucked in there." He went after Miss Crawley, and Smidge did too. They were standing right behind her when she opened the door, and they heard a voice outside say, "My name's Peck. I'm from Swedish radio and television." Smidge felt himself go cold. He peeped cautiously out from behind Miss Crawley's skirts, and there stood a gentleman, clearly one of those handsome, thoroughly clever, perfectly plump men in their prime, who Miss Crawley said there were so many of on television. "Could I speak to Miss Hilda Crawl, please?" asked Miss Peck. "Yes, that's me, Miss Crawley. But I've paid my TV license, so don't get any ideas." Mr. Peck gave her a friendly smile. "I'm not here about your license. No, it's those hauntings you wrote to us about. We'd like to make a program about them." Miss Crawley blushed bright red. She didn't say a word. "What's the matter? Aren't you feeling well, Miss Peck?" Mr. Peck eventually inquired. "No," said Miss Crawley. "I'm not feeling well. This is the worst moment of my life." Smidge, standing right behind her, felt much the same thing. Lordy, lordy, the game was really up now. Any second Mr. Peck would see Karlson, and by the time Mom and Dad had got home tomorrow, the whole house would be full of cables and television cameras and perfectly plump men, and not a moment's peace and quiet. Oh, lordy, lordy, how could he smuggle Karlson out of sight? Then his eye fell on the old wooden chest standing in the hall. Sally used it for all her dressing up stuff. She and her classmates had some silly club, and sometimes they met at Sally's and dressed up and wandered around pretending to be totally different people. It was called drama, and it was pretty stupid, Smidge thought. But oh, what a good job the chest was there just now. Smidge opened the lid and said to Karlson in a nervous whisper, "Hurry up, hide in this chest." And though Karlson had no idea why he had to hide, he wasn't one to refuse if there was the chance of a bit of jiggery-pokery. He gave Smidge a sly wink and leapt into the chest. Smidge promptly shut the lid. He glanced anxiously at the two by the door. Hadn't they noticed anything? They hadn't. Mr. Peck and Miss Crawley were trying to get to the bottom of why Miss Crawley didn't feel well. There were hauntings, said Miss Crawley, on the verge of tears. They were just wretched boys' tricks, the lot of them. So you weren't being haunted, then? Said Mr. Peck. Then Miss Crawley started out crying in earnest. No, I wasn't being haunted. And now I'll never be on TV. Only Frida. Mr. Peck gave her a comforting pat on the arm. Please don't take it so hard, Miss Crawley. Perhaps one day you will, in some other context. No, I won't, said Miss Crawley. She sank down onto the drama chest and covered her face in her hands. There she sat, weeping. Smidge felt so sorry for her and ashamed that the whole thing was his fault. Then there was a low rumbling sound from the chest. Oh, sorry, said Miss Crawley. It's only because I'm so hungry. Ah, that's stomachs for you, said Mr. Peck kindly. But your lunch must be virtually ready. I can smell something nice. What's cooking? Just a stew, sobbed Miss Crawley. It's my own invention. Hilda's spicy special, I call it. It smells wonderful, said Mr. Peck. Enough to make your mouth water. Miss Crawley got up from the chest. Well, you're welcome to sample it, because these little monkeys won't eat it. Mr. Peck said he couldn't possibly, and it wouldn't be right. But in the end, he and Miss Crawley went off to the kitchen together. Smidge lifted the lid of the chest and looked at Karlson, who was lying there, rumbling gently. Stay in there until he's gone, for goodness sakes, said Smidge, or you'll end up in the TV box. Said Karlson. That box is quite a tight squeeze, too, let me tell you. So Smidge propped the chest lid a bit open to give Karlson some air and dashed off to the kitchen. He wanted to see Mr. Peck's face when he tried Miss Crawley's spicy special. But guess what? Mr. Peck was at the table, gobbling it up as if it was the tastiest dish he'd ever tried. He had no tears in his eyes at all. But Miss Crawley did. Not from the stew, of course, but because she was still crying about her ghost program that had come to nothing. It didn't help that Mr. Peck was a big fan of her fire porridge. She was still upset. But then, something incredible happened. Mr. Peck suddenly announced out of nowhere, I've got it. You can be on tomorrow evening. Miss Crawley looked at him, red-eyed. Be on what? She asked gloomily. On television, of course, said Mr. Peck. In our My Best Recipe slot. You can show the whole of Sweden how to make Hilda's spicy special. There was a thud. Miss Crawley had fainted. But she soon came round and hauled herself up off the floor. Her eyes were shining. Tomorrow evening? On TV, you say? My spicy special. You want me to make it for the whole of Sweden? Lordy, lordy, and just think, Frida, she's absolutely clueless about cooking, and she calls my spicy special chicken feed. Smidge was totally engrossed. This was very interesting. He'd almost forgotten about Karlson in the chest, but now, to his horror, he heard someone coming across the hall, and sure enough it was Karlson. The door between the hall and the kitchen was open, and Smidge could see him coming long before Miss Crawley or Peck noticed anything. Yes, it was Karlson, and yet it wasn't. Lordy, lordy, what did he look like? All dressed up in Sally's old drama costume, with a long velvet skirt dragging around his legs, and gauzy veils hanging down back and front. He looked more like a cheery little old lady than anything else. And the cheery little old lady was approachingly, doggedly. Smidge gestured wildly to make Karlson realize he mustn't come in, but Karlson didn't seem to understand, and in he came. Noble maiden, she enters the king's high hall, said Karlson, and there he stood in the doorway, with his veils and everything. It was a vision that made Mr. Peck's eyes pop out on stalks. Who on earth? Who's this funny little girl? He said. Miss Crawley couldn't contain herself. Funny little girl? No, the most appalling young scamp of a boy I've ever met in my life. Get out of here, you horrible child. But Karlson wasn't listening. Noble maiden, she dances, and her heart is glad, he said. And he began a dance. Smidge had never seen anything like it, and it didn't look as if Mr. Peck had either. Karlson shimmied around the room, his legs strangely bent at the knee. From time to time he did little leaps and waved his veils over. It looks totally weird, thought Smidge. But as long as he doesn't start flying, I suppose it doesn't matter. Oh, I hope he won't. Karlson had so many veils draped around him that you couldn't see his propeller. Smidge was glad of that. But what if Karlson suddenly took off? Mr. Peck would have a fit, and then be rushing here with his TV cameras as soon as he came to his senses again. Mr. Peck was watching the strange dance and laughing. He laughed more and more. That made Karlson giggle too, and flutter his eyelashes at Mr. Peck as he shimmied past and waved the veils at him. "Rather amusing boy," said Mr. Peck. "We could have him on one of our children's programs." He couldn't have said anything to infuriate Miss Crawley more. Put him on TV. In that case, you'd rather not be there. In that case, I'd rather not be there. Though obviously if you want someone to turn your studios upside down, there's no better choice than him. Smidge nodded. And once he's turned the studios upside down, he'll say it's a mere trifle. You have to watch him. Mr. Peck didn't insist. On second thoughts, it was only an idea, and there are so many other youngsters after all. Mr. Peck was in a hurry now anyway, because he had to get to a recording. He was just about to go. Then Smidge saw Karlson start to feel for his winder. He had trouble getting to it because of all the veils. Mr. Peck had already reached the door when Karlson's motor whirred into life. "I didn't know the airport flight path went over this part of Stockholm," Mr. Peck said. "They really should do something about it. Goodbye, Miss Crawley. See you tomorrow." And he went. But Karlson rose to the ceiling and waved his veils at Miss Crawley. "Noble maiden, she takes to the air. Woohoo!" he said. And that is the end of chapter 9. That's the end of our reading for today. I hope you enjoyed that one. I actually thought that that would be Miss Crawley that would be taken into the air, but it turns out I was wrong, and it was Karlson who just dressed up. But yeah, so join back in next time for the last chapter, which is called Handsome, Thoroughly Clever, and Perfectly Plump. And that's the last short chapter of this book. And after that, we will be starting a new one. And I'll tell you guys about that book next time. So, thank you for watching, and have a wonderful weekend.